Eleanor Whitmore burned the letter in the kitchen fire before the ink had fully dried. Her hands did not shake. That surprised her. 7 languages lived inside her: French, Spanish, Latin, Italian, Portuguese, Greek, and the Cherokee tongue her father had spent a decade learning in the hills. 7 languages, and not one of them had been enough to make Thomas Harrington stay. Now the most powerful man in Virginia was standing at her door, hat in hand, telling her she was the only person alive who could save his estate from complete ruin. If you're new here, please subscribe and follow Eleanor's story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The morning Thomas Harrington ended their engagement, he did it in front of witnesses. That was the part Eleanor could never quite forgive. Not the ending itself; she had felt it coming for months, slow and cold, as winter moving through old window glass, but the audience he chose. The sitting room of the Whitmore house had been full that Saturday. Her aunt, her 2 cousins, the Reverend Aldgate and his wife, who had stopped in for tea and stayed far too long. 3 neighboring women who had no reason to be there at all, except that gossip in Hanover County. Virginia traveled faster than any horse. Thomas stood in the center of the room like a man delivering a verdict he had already decided was just. He was 31 years old and had never once doubted himself in Eleanor's presence. She had always found that both admirable and quietly terrifying. "I have given this matter considerable thought," he said, "and I believe it is better for both parties if we dissolve the arrangement." Eleanor set down her teacup. She did it slowly, deliberately, because her hands wanted to do something less controlled, and she would not give him the satisfaction. "Both parties," she repeated. "Yes." He glanced around the room, taking inventory of his audience, she realized, making certain everyone was paying attention. "You are a woman of considerable education. That is not something I dispute. But a household requires a certain kind of woman, a certain temperament, and I have come to believe in good conscience that you and I want different things from a life together." The Reverend's wife made a small sound, something between sympathy and relief, as though a difficult social situation had finally been resolved rather than created. Eleanor looked at Thomas Harrington, at his careful suit, his careful expression, his careful calculated words, and understood something she had perhaps always known, but never let herself fully see. He was not ending this because of incompatibility. He was ending it because she had corrected him in front of his business associates 3 weeks prior, pointing out an error in a trade calculation that would have cost him $200. She had done it quietly. She had done it kindly. She had done it because it was the right thing to do. And Thomas Harrington was not a man who could love a woman who was right when he was wrong. "A wife should bring beauty into a home," he said, and his voice had taken on that particular quality. She recognized the one he used when he wanted something to sound like wisdom, not arguments. Someone in the room laughed. She never knew who. In her memory, the sound simply existed, sourceless, directionless, filling the room like smoke. Eleanor stood up. She was not tall. She had never been the kind of woman a room noticed when she entered. Brown hair, brown eyes, a face that people described as pleasant when they were being kind and ordinary when they were not. She wore a gray dress that morning because it was sensible, and she had not known there would be an audience. "Then I suppose," she said, "you had better find yourself a home with very beautiful arguments." She walked out of her own sitting room. She walked through the kitchen, out the back door, down the path that led to her father's old study in the converted garden shed, and she sat down among his books and his papers and his 30 years of accumulated knowledge, and she pressed her hands flat on the desk and breathed. Her father. Professor Edmund Whitmore had died 2 years prior. He had been a linguist, a historian, an agricultural theorist, and a man who had made the single catastrophic professional mistake of being interested in too many things at once, which in academic circles was considered either genius or lack of discipline, depending on who was being asked. He had spent his career at William and Mary, until a dispute over methodology. Eleanor had never been given the full details, only the shape of the wound had ended his position there. He had returned to Hanover County to his modest family land. continued his research privately, and raised Eleanor alone after her mother died when Eleanor was 7. He had taught her French because it was the language of diplomacy, Spanish because it was the language of the New World's future, Latin because it was the foundation of legal and scientific language, Italian because he loved the poetry, Portuguese because it opened the Atlantic trade routes to understanding, Greek because nothing else would do for philosophy, and Cherokee because he believed deeply practically, without romanticism, that any man who owned land in Virginia and did not understand the people who had lived on that land before him was a fool building on a foundation he couldn't see. Eleanor had learned all of it, not to impress anyone, not to secure a better marriage, simply because her father had offered the knowledge and she had been hungry for it in the way some people are hungry for food, constantly instinctively, without being able to entirely explain why. It had never until Thomas Harrington felt like a liability. She sat in her father's study that morning for 2 hours. When she came back inside, the guests had gone. Her Aunt Martha was in the kitchen, with an expression that managed to combine genuine sympathy with something Eleanor recognized as social embarrassment. "You'll want to stay home for a few days?" Martha said, not unkindly. "Let things settle." "What things?" Eleanor asked. "Talk," Martha said. "There will be talk." There was talk. Hanover County, in the summer of 1816, was not a large community. It was the kind of place where everyone knew which families owed, which debts, and whose daughter had done what, at whose party. And the story of Thomas Harrington ending his engagement to Edmund Whitmore's peculiar, overeducated daughter spread across the county with remarkable efficiency. The version Eleanor heard secondhand because she did stay home for 3 days, not out of shame, but because she had her father's papers to organize, and she preferred useful work to social performance, was that Thomas had acted nobly in a difficult situation, that he had been patient with a woman who regrettably had never quite understood her station, that it was a shame, really, because the Whitmore family had once been respectable, but Edmund's eccentricities had perhaps done Eleanor no favors. No one said she was intelligent. No one mentioned that she spoke 7 languages, or that she had spent the last 2 years quietly organizing her father's agricultural research into a coherent body of work that no one had asked to see. No one noted that she had twice identified errors in local property assessments that had saved neighboring farmers from overpayment, or that she had done it without compensation because it had seemed like the right thing to do, and because she was a woman and women in Hanover County in 1816 did not charge fees for intellectual labor. What people said was poor Miss Whitmore, a bit too bookish, a bit too much her father's daughter. It's a shame she couldn't manage to be more well. You know, Eleanor organized her father's papers. She read his notes on agricultural land contracts in Virginia from 1790 to 1814. She cataloged his correspondence with surveyors, property lawyers, and farmers from 6 counties, and she waited, though she would not have called it waiting for something she could not have named, to find its way to her door. It found its way there on a Thursday 6 weeks after Thomas Harrington's announcement. The man at the door was not Nathaniel Caldwell himself. It was his estate manager, a compact, serious man named Grover Finch, who had the bearing of someone accustomed to delivering messages he hadn't composed. "Mr. Caldwell sends his regards," Finch said, holding his hat in both hands, in the way men did when they were uncomfortable and trying not to show it. "He asks if Miss Whitmore might be available to attend a meeting at Caldwell Estate tomorrow morning. He understands it is an unusual request." Eleanor studied Finch's face. "What kind of meeting?" she asked. Finch hesitated. "A business matter. Mr. Caldwell says, and these are his words, ma'am, that he has a problem only someone with your particular knowledge can address." Eleanor had heard of Nathaniel Caldwell the way everyone in the county had heard of him, as a fact, like the river or the weather. His family had owned the largest estate in Hanover County for 3 generations. He had taken over management after his father's death 18 months prior, and was known to be competent, reclusive, and not given to making requests he hadn't already decided were necessary. She had never spoken to him directly. She had seen him at 2 county gatherings, a tall, dark-haired man with the kind of stillness about him that some people read as arrogance and others read as grief. He had been at the agricultural agreement signing 2 months ago, the one she had almost attended, before deciding that walking into a room full of Thomas Harrington's business associates was not something she was prepared to do yet. She looked at Finch. "Tell Mr. Caldwell I'll be there at 9, she said. Tin. Caldwell Estate at 9 in the morning in July was a different thing than Eleanor had anticipated. She had expected grandeur performed for visitors, the particular kind of careful impression wealthy households made when they knew they were being observed. What she found instead was a house in the middle of something. Men moving between buildings with purpose. A wagon being loaded near the East Outbuilding. 3 people in what appeared to be rapid conversation near the main entrance, who did not stop talking when Eleanor arrived. Finch met her at the gate and walked her to a large room off the main hall that had the organized chaos of a space being actively used for work rather than display. Papers covered 2 long tables. 3 men she didn't recognize sat along the far wall, with the patient, tense look of people waiting for a decision. Nathaniel Caldwell was standing at the central table with a document in his hand, and he was reading it with the expression of a man who has read the same passage 4 times and found it wrong each time. He looked up when she entered. Eleanor had prepared herself in a general way for the experience of meeting a powerful man in his professional environment. She had not entirely prepared herself for the specific quality of Nathaniel Caldwell's attention, which was direct in a way that was not performative. He did not look at her the way Thomas Harrington had looked at her, measuring, comparing, making assessments she wasn't supposed to notice. He looked at her the way a man looked at something that had arrived precisely when he needed it, and he wasn't sure yet if that was luck or something else. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Thank you for coming." "Mr. Caldwell." She didn't move toward the table until he gestured toward it. "Sit, please." He set the document down. "We have a problem, and I'm going to tell you about it plainly, because I don't have time for anything less than plain." "I appreciate that," Eleanor said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, more like recalibration. 18 months ago my father died, Nathaniel said. He left the estate in order, or I believed he did. In the past 3 months, I have received documents claiming that 6 families currently working land on Caldwell property owe debts that, according to these contracts, entitle the creditor to seize their farms. The amounts are substantial. The contracts appear legitimate. He paused. They are not legitimate. "How do you know?" Eleanor asked. "Because my father did not make these agreements," Nathaniel said flatly. "I know his hand. I know his business practices. And I know that 2 of these families have worked this land for 40 years, and my father would sooner have signed away the main house than put them out." He looked at the papers. "Someone has forged these documents, and they have done it well enough that every attorney I have consulted has told me the contracts will hold in court." Eleanor looked at the documents on the table. "May I?" she asked. He nodded. She picked up the nearest contract, read it through once quickly, then again slowly. "The Latin," she said. "Pardon, the legal Latin in the property clause." She set the document down and picked up a second one. "It's been translated from something. The phrasing is idiomatic. It reads like a direct translation of a Spanish legal formula I've seen in my father's correspondence with trade attorneys in Charleston. The original English legal language for this type of clause would look different. Whoever wrote this knew property law, but they learned it through a Spanish-language legal framework first." She looked up. "Do you know anyone associated with these contracts who spent time in Spanish territories?" The 3 men along the wall had stopped pretending to look elsewhere. Nathaniel was very still. "Yes," he said. "I do." "Then that's your first thread," Eleanor said. "Would you like me to keep pulling it?" The silence in the room lasted approximately 4 seconds. "Miss Whitmore," Nathaniel said, and his voice had changed in a way she couldn't immediately name, become less armored somehow, without becoming less serious. "I believe I would." She stayed until the afternoon. She went through 11 documents in that time. Not quickly, carefully, the way her father had taught her, which was to read everything twice and assume nothing was accidental. The pattern emerged by the second hour. The same handwriting appeared in the margin notations of 3 separate contracts. Small annotations that were meant to look like a clerk's routine notes, but which Eleanor recognized as a specific shorthand system. She had seen that shorthand before. Not often. Once in a letter her father had received from a legal associate in Richmond, and once in the draft of a trade agreement that Thomas Harrington had asked her to review 2 years ago before their engagement, when he had still found her knowledge useful rather than threatening. She did not say that yet. She set the 3 documents side by side. "The margin notations," she said. "They're written in a private shorthand. I've encountered it before in a different context. It's used by people who trained under a specific legal firm in Richmond. Harrington and Associates, established 1801. Nathaniel looked at her. "Harrington?" "Yes. Thomas Harrington's family. His father founded the firm," Eleanor said. "Thomas worked there briefly before his father died, and he took over the family trade operations." The room was very quiet. "Miss Whitmore," Nathaniel said slowly, "are you telling me that Thomas Harrington is behind this?" "I'm telling you that someone who trained under Harrington and Associates wrote these margin notations," Eleanor said carefully. "Whether that person is Thomas himself or someone who worked alongside him, I can't yet say. The handwriting in the main body of the contracts is different from the notations. 2 people are involved at minimum." "You recognize the shorthand from his letters to you?" She met his eyes. "From a trade document he asked me to review once. He thought I'd catch mathematical errors. I caught those. I also noticed the notation system, but at the time I had no reason to consider it significant." Nathaniel sat back. There was something moving behind his expression, something with weight to it. Eleanor had the distinct impression he was not a man who wasted energy on uncomplicated feelings. "He ended your engagement 6 weeks ago," Nathaniel said. "Yes, and now his name appears in documents being used to steal land from families on my estate." "His firm's notation system appears," Eleanor corrected. "The distinction matters legally." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "It does," he said. "You're right." A pause. "You're also the only person who has looked at these documents and found anything in them other than evidence that I'm going to lose a legal case." "You're not going to lose," Eleanor said. It came out with more certainty than she had intended. "You sound confident," he said. "I'm confident that the evidence is there," she said. "Whether we can surface it correctly is a different question." "What do you need?" "Your father's original land records," she said. "All of them back 20 years, and I'd like access to the correspondence files, specifically anything involving land transactions in the south quarter of the estate, which is where 4 of the 6 affected families are located." She paused. "And I'll need to speak with the families themselves." "Why?" "Because forged documents don't exist in a vacuum," Eleanor said. "Someone approached these families. Someone presented these contracts to them. Someone was there in person, and people remember faces even when they don't remember documents." She looked at the papers spread across the table. "The legal evidence will tell us what was done. The people will tell us how it was done. And how it was done will tell us who did it." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then, "You've done this before." "Not exactly this," Eleanor admitted. "I helped 2 farming families near my father's land dispute incorrect property assessments. The method is similar." "The method," he repeated. "Documents lie in specific ways," Eleanor said. "People who forge them make specific kinds of mistakes. My father spent years cataloging those patterns. I know them." Nathaniel stood. "I'll have the records ready tomorrow morning. Can you return?" "Yes. And the families, I'll arrange for you to meet with them. But I want you to understand, Miss Whitmore." He stopped. "What?" she asked. "Thomas Harrington is respected in this county," he said. "If we pursue this, and we're wrong, or if we don't have enough, the consequences fall on you more than on me. I can absorb an accusation. You cannot." Eleanor looked at the forged contracts on the table. She thought of 6 families who might lose everything they had spent their lives building because someone had decided that their homes were a convenient asset to acquire. She thought of her father's voice reading her agricultural law in the evenings, patient and precise, as if knowledge were a gift rather than a weight. She thought of Thomas Harrington's face in her sitting room performing justice for an audience of Tea Party guests. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "I've been absorbing consequences for being who I am my entire life. At least this time I'd be absorbing them for something worth doing." He looked at her steadily. "All right," he said. "Then we'll do this right." Sure. She walked home that evening through the long summer light. The air smelled of cut grass and river water and the particular warm heaviness of Virginia in July, and Eleanor Whitmore walked through it with her father's old leather satchel over her shoulder, full of notes she had taken in Nathaniel Caldwell's document room, and she thought about threads. Her father had always said that the best way to understand a complicated thing was to find one thread and follow it without letting go. She had found hers. Now she had to follow it all the way to the place it was anchored, no matter what it was connected to, no matter who had tied it there, no matter what it would cost her when the truth finally came loose. She was the daughter of a scholar who had taught her that knowledge was not a decoration. She was a woman who had spent 25 years being told that everything she knew was either irrelevant or inappropriate. She was the only person in Hanover County who had looked at 11 forged land contracts and understood not just what they said, but what they meant, where they came from, and exactly how they had been designed to hold up in a court of law until someone took them apart from the inside. Thomas Harrington had once told her that a wife should bring beauty into a home. Eleanor had always thought that was a strange thing to want. She had never been particularly interested in beauty. What she was interested in, what she had always been interested in from the time she was 8 years old, sitting beside her father in his study while he translated contracts by lamplight, was the truth. And the truth she had learned was always there. It was simply waiting for someone willing to find it. Eleanor returned to Caldwell Estate the next morning with her father's largest notebook and a list of 17 questions she had written by lamplight the night before. She had not slept much. Not because of anxiety, or not only because of anxiety, but because her mind had kept moving through the documents the way it always did, when it found something real to work on. Pulling at one thread, finding it connected to another, following that one until it branched again. By 2 in the morning, she had filled 6 pages of notes. By 4, she had a theory she couldn't yet prove, but could feel the shape of, the way you could feel the shape of a key before you knew which lock it fit. Finch met her at the gate again, but this time, he didn't have the uncomfortable bearing of a man delivering an unusual message. He had the bearing of a man who had already been told to expect her, and had decided she was going to be useful. That was a different thing entirely. "Mr. Caldwell is in the East Records room," Finch said. "He's had the land files pulled back to 1795, and the first family, the Harpers, will arrive at 10. "Good," Eleanor said. "I'll start with the records." The East Records room was smaller than the document room from the day before and contained 3 times as much material. Nathaniel was already there, standing over a table covered in bound ledgers, and he looked like a man who had not slept much either, which Eleanor found oddly steadying. There was something clarifying about seeing competent people in the middle of difficulty. It reminded her that difficulty was not the same thing as defeat. "Miss Whitmore," he said without looking up from the ledger. "Tell me what you need." "The original survey maps for the South Quarter going back 20 years, she said, setting her satchel down. "And I need to understand your father's filing system before I start pulling documents out of sequence." "He organized by transaction date, not by plot," Nathaniel said. "Which means if you're looking for everything related to a specific property, you have to cross-reference. Do you have an index? I have 3 of them. None of them agree with each other." Eleanor looked at the ledgers. "Then I start at the beginning," she said. She found the first serious anomaly by 9:15. It was not in the forged contracts themselves. She had expected it to be there, and whoever had crafted the forgeries was careful enough that the surface of the documents was clean. The anomaly was in the original estate records in a land survey from 1809 that recorded the boundary markers for 4 properties in the South Quarter. The survey had been corrected. Someone had gone into the original document and altered 3 measurements, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw immediate attention, but enough to shift the recorded boundary of Plot 7 slightly south, Plot 9 slightly east, and Plot 12 slightly north. Small adjustments, perhaps 200 feet in each direction. 200 feet didn't sound like much until you looked at what those adjustments accomplished. They created on paper a parcel of disputed land between the 4 affected properties. Land that, according to the altered survey, had never formally belonged to any individual family. Land that could therefore be claimed as uncategorized estate property. Land that, once categorized as such, could be sold. Eleanor sat with the survey in her hands for a full minute without moving. Then she said, "Mr. Caldwell." He was across the room, working through a separate stack of correspondence files. He came over without asking why, which she noted. She showed him the measurements. "These 3 numbers have been altered," she said. "The original ink is slightly different, darker, with a different nib width. Someone went back to this document after it was filed and made corrections. Careful corrections, but not careful enough about the ink." Nathaniel looked at the survey. His jaw tightened. "My father would have noticed that," he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "He would have." "Which means this was done after he died." "Within the last 18 months, Eleanor said. "And whoever did it had access to the estate records." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. "Who has access to these rooms?" Eleanor asked. "Myself, Finch. My father's former attorney, James Alderton, though he retired to Fredericksburg 6 months ago. And—" Nathaniel stopped. "And?" Eleanor said. "The estate hosted a legal review last spring," Nathaniel said carefully. "Standard procedure after a death in ownership. 3 attorneys came to review the property documentation. One of them was from Richmond." Eleanor's pen stopped moving. "From which firm?" she asked. "I'd have to check the correspondence," Nathaniel said. "But I remember the name. Whitfield. Samuel Whitfield." A pause. "Is that name significant to you?" "Samuel Whitfield trained under Harrington and Associates for 4 years," Eleanor said. "He left the firm in 1812. My father wrote about him once, a legal dispute over a Charleston shipping contract. He called him meticulous and opportunistic." Nathaniel didn't move. "You knew that from memory," he said. "My father's correspondence files are extensive," Eleanor said. "I spent 6 months organizing them after he died. Names stay with me." She set the survey down. "Mr. Caldwell, this is not a simple forgery scheme. Someone spent time here, in this house, in this room, going through your father's records with enough patience to make changes that would hold up to casual inspection. And they came in through a legal review that I authorized," Nathaniel said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was controlled in a particular way that Eleanor recognized, not suppressed anger exactly. More like anger being held at a specific distance so it couldn't interfere with clear thinking. "How do we prove it?" he said. "We prove the survey was altered by finding the original measurements," Eleanor said. "Your father was meticulous. I can see that from how he organized these records. He would have kept his own notes on every survey separate from the official documentation. Surveyors always give landowners a secondary copy. Is there a personal record book, something he kept separately from the estate files?" Nathaniel was very still. Then he turned and walked to the far wall where a locked cabinet stood that Eleanor had noticed when she came in and had assumed contained financial ledgers. He unlocked it. Inside on the 3rd shelf was a series of cloth-bound personal journals, 13 of them organized by year. He pulled the one marked 1809 and set it on the table. Eleanor opened it. She found the survey notes on the 42nd page. The original measurements were there, precise, clear, written in a different hand from the official documentation. They were not what the altered survey said they were. The difference was not ambiguous. "There it is," Eleanor said quietly. Nathaniel looked at the numbers. "He kept everything," he said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite grief, but lived in the same neighborhood. "Yes," Eleanor said. "He did. And that is why they didn't win." The Harper family arrived at 10 o'clock. There were 3 of them. James Harper, who was 62 and had the deliberate movements of a man who had spent his entire life doing physical labor and was proud of every year of it. His wife Ruth, who was 58, and had the particular quality of stillness that Eleanor recognized as a woman who had survived many difficult things by becoming very good at waiting. And their son Daniel, who was 24 and furious in the direct, unfiltered way of young men who have not yet learned where to put their anger. They sat across from Eleanor and Nathaniel at the long table, and James Harper put the offending contract down in front of them with the careful movements of someone handling something they despise. "We've been on this land for 41 years, James said. "My father's father cleared it. My father built the first house. I built the second. My son was born in it." He looked at the contract. "And now some paper says we owe $900 we've never heard of." "When did you receive this?" Eleanor asked. "March," Ruth said. "A man came to the house, well-dressed, said he was representing an estate creditor, which we didn't understand because we've never had dealings with any creditor. Said our late tenancy agreement, which doesn't exist because there's never been one. We've always operated under a handshake arrangement. With old Mr. Caldwell said our tenancy agreement had included a deferred payment clause." She paused. "We don't read contracts, ma'am. James can read enough to get by." "But legal writing. Who was the man?" Eleanor asked. "He said his name was Whitfield," James said. "Samuel Whitfield out of Richmond." Eleanor wrote it down. Didn't let her expression change, though she felt something tighten in her chest. "Did he leave you any documents besides the contract?" she asked. "A letter," Ruth said. She reached into the front of her dress and produced a folded paper with the careful preservation of someone who has kept an important thing close to their body because they don't trust anywhere else. Eleanor took it, unfolded it, read it. It was on legal letterhead, Whitfield and Associates, Richmond. The language was formal and precise and designed to be incomprehensible to anyone without legal training. But the signature at the bottom was not Whitfield's. It was a countersignature, and Eleanor recognized it. She had seen that signature on a trade document 2 years ago on a table in a comfortable Charleston house next to a glass of wine and a man who had told her she was the most interesting woman he'd ever met. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, keeping her voice even, "I need you to look at this signature." He leaned across and read it. "T. Harrington," he said. "Thomas Harrington," Eleanor confirmed. Daniel Harper made a sound that was not quite a word. "The man who was engaged to you," James Harper said slowly. He was looking at Eleanor with an expression that was trying to work out something complicated. "Formerly," Eleanor said. "And now his name is on the letter threatening to take our farm," James said. "Yes." James Harper looked at Nathaniel. "Mr. Caldwell, is she trustworthy?" Nathaniel didn't hesitate. "She's the only person in this county I'd trust with this." James looked at Eleanor for a long moment. Then he nodded once, with the slow finality of a man making a decision he won't unmake. "What do you need from us?" he asked. "Everything you remember about the day Whitfield came," Eleanor said. "What he said in what order. Whether he was alone. Whether he seemed familiar with the property. Did he know specific things about your land without being told? And anything else, anything at all that seemed wrong in a way you couldn't explain." Ruth and James looked at each other. "He knew about the creek boundary," Ruth said quietly. "Before James mentioned it, he said, the parcel runs to the lower creek line, is that correct? And James said yes because it does. But we never said a word about any creek." Eleanor wrote that down. The creek boundary, in the altered survey, the one that had moved 200 feet. Someone had given Whitfield the altered measurements before he ever arrived at the Harper farm. Someone had briefed him. The second family came at noon, the Mortons. Younger William Morton was 38, his wife Clara was 35. 3 children between 10 and 16 who had stayed home. They had a different story in its details, and the same story in its shape. The same man Whitfield, the same confident knowledge of boundary specifics that he shouldn't have had. A different contract, but the same handwriting in the margin notations. A letter signed by the same countersignature. When they left, William Morton stopped at the door. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I heard what happened, with Harrington, in the spring." Eleanor looked at him. "A lot of people heard," she said carefully. "My wife said you were probably better off," William said. "I said a woman who can do what you're doing in there with those papers, that's not someone who was ever going to fit inside whatever life he had planned." He paused, awkward with it, not sure he'd said it right. "I just wanted to say, we appreciate you being here." Eleanor looked at her notepad. "I appreciate having something useful to do," she said. Which was true and complete, and she left it at that. By 2 in the afternoon, Eleanor had interviewed 3 families and built a sequence of events she could now describe with confidence. In the spring of 1815, while Nathaniel Caldwell was still in the first months of managing his father's estate, Samuel Whitfield had attended the legal review and had used that access to alter survey records in the East Records Room. He had been working from information provided by someone who knew the Caldwell estate well and who had specifically identified 6 families whose tenancy arrangements were informal enough to be challenged. That someone had prepared false contracts using knowledge of specific legal frameworks taught at Harrington and Associates, and had countersigned collection letters with a name that would carry legal weight in a county court. Thomas Harrington had not been a passive beneficiary of someone else's scheme. He had been its architect. Eleanor sat with that fact for a moment. She had spent 6 weeks telling herself that the engagement ending was survivable. That it had been the right thing, even if the manner of it had been wrong. That she was better positioned alone than bound to a man who wanted a wife shaped like an ornament. She had been right about all of that. What she had not known, what she was only now understanding, was that the man who had called her unfit to stand beside him had spent the months before and after their engagement using her father's methods, her father's frameworks, her father's life's work to steal land from families who trusted the county's legal system to protect them. He had taken everything her father had built and turned it into a tool for precisely the kind of harm her father had spent his life working against. Eleanor set down her pen. "Miss Whitmore?" Nathaniel's voice was quiet. She looked up. "This is a great deal to carry," he said. "I want you to know I understand that this has become personal in a way that goes beyond the documents." "It was always personal," Eleanor said. "I just didn't know why yet." "We can stop for today." "We cannot," Eleanor said. 3 more families are coming tomorrow. The court date is in 6 weeks. And what I have now is enough to build a case, but not enough to win one. She picked up her pen. "I need the original signed version of every tenancy arrangement your father made with these families. Not formal contracts. I know those don't exist, but your father was systematic. He kept records of everything. There will be something." "His personal journals," Nathaniel said. "Yes. Starting from the year each family took occupancy. I need his notes on every agreement, even informal ones, especially informal ones." She paused. "And I need your honest answer to something." "Ask it," he said. "Is there anyone at this estate, anyone currently employed here, anyone with ongoing access who might have an interest in seeing this scheme succeed, or who might warn Harrington that we're building a case?" The question sat between them. Nathaniel didn't answer immediately, which Eleanor respected. He was thinking about it genuinely, not dismissing it. "Finch has been with this estate for 12 years, Nathaniel said finally. "I'd stake my life on him. The house staff similarly. Most of them have been here since my father's time." He stopped. "Alderton." "Your father's former attorney." He retired to Fredericksburg, but he handled every land transaction on this estate for 30 years. If someone wanted detailed knowledge of which families had informal arrangements... Nathaniel stopped again. Alderton was the one who recommended Whitfield for the legal review. Eleanor's pen stilled. "Did he?" she said. "He said Whitfield was highly regarded, efficient." Nathaniel's expression had become very controlled again. "I had no reason to question it. You need to find out if Alderton has any financial connection to Whitfield or to any of Harrington's business ventures," Eleanor said. Quietly, without alerting either of them. She thought for a moment. "Do you have a contact in Richmond? Someone you trust outside of this county's business circles?" "My cousin," Nathaniel said. "Robert Caldwell. He's an import merchant. He knows every attorney in Richmond by reputation at minimum." "Write to him today," Eleanor said. "Ask him to look into Whitfield's current client list. We don't need proof yet. We need a map." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "You think in sequence," he said. "My father taught me that you can't argue against a chain," Eleanor said. "You can't say this link is wrong. You have to show where the chain begins and where it ends and what it was built to hold." She looked at the journals spread across the table. "Right now, I know the middle. I need the ends. And if the ends lead somewhere more dangerous than a county court case?" Nathaniel asked. Eleanor met his eyes. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "6 families stand to lose everything they have built in their lifetimes because a man I was engaged to decided their homes were a profitable inconvenience. I passed the point of being frightened by how far this goes approximately 3 hours ago." She picked up the 1809 journal again. "Now, show me where your father kept his 1808 records." They worked until the light failed. At some point, Finch appeared with food that neither of them had asked for, bread, cold meat, a pot of coffee, and set it on the corner of the table without interrupting, which Eleanor found she was grateful for. Nathaniel poured the coffee without asking how she took it and set a cup beside her work. She noticed he had remembered from the morning that she drank it without sugar. She hadn't said anything at the time. He had simply watched and filed the information away. She was beginning to understand how his mind worked, and she found it surprisingly similar to the way her own mind worked, which was disconcerting and interesting in equal measure. "Your father's notes on the Morton tenancy agreement," she said, not looking up. "April 1801. He writes here that the boundary arrangement was made verbally in the presence of 2 witnesses. Do you see the names?" Nathaniel leaned over to read. "Reverend Aldgate and Henry Finch," he said. "That's Grover Finch's father. Reverend Aldgate is still in the county. He retired, but he's alive. And Henry Finch died in 1811. But Grover was there. He was 17. He helped his father with the estate that summer." Nathaniel looked up from the journal. Grover would remember. "A surviving witness to the original verbal agreement," Eleanor said. "That's not ironclad, but it establishes that the agreement existed before the forged contract claims it did." She made a note. "And Reverend Aldgate for the second witness." "Aldgate is 80 years old," Nathaniel said. 80-year-old men can testify," Eleanor said. "We'll need someone to take down his statement formally, a notary." "Miss Whitmore." Nathaniel's voice had changed. She looked up. "You're building a legal case," he said. "From witness statements and original documents and handwriting analysis." "Yes," she said. "That's what I've been doing all day." "Without being asked to," he said. "I asked you to look at documents. I didn't ask you to build us a strategy for court." Eleanor considered that. "Would you prefer I hadn't?" she asked. "No," he said immediately. "No, He stopped. "I want to understand something. You've spent the last 8 hours doing work that most attorneys in this county would charge considerable fees to perform, and you came here knowing that the name we'd find at the end of this was going to be his." "Yes," Eleanor said, "and you came anyway." "The families needed someone to come," she said simply. He was quiet for a moment. "You could have refused," he said. "No one would have thought less of you. Most people would have said it was understandable given. Most people already think whatever they're going to think about me, Eleanor said. I've been the woman who was refused, the woman who reads too many books, the woman who doesn't know her station. What people think has not historically been an accurate record of what I'm actually capable of. She closed the journal and picked up the next one. Mr. Caldwell, I need the 1806 records. He brought her the 1806 records. But for a moment, before he set the journal down, he paused. Miss Whitmore, he said, and his voice was different again, quieter, something in it that hadn't been there that morning. What you're doing here, the family should know it's you doing it, not just that it's being done. Eleanor looked up at him. She didn't know what to do with the particular quality of that statement. It was not flattery. It was not sympathy. It was something more specific than either of those things. Something that sounded like the beginning of a different kind of attention, careful and clear-eyed, and she was not prepared to examine what that meant right now. The families will know what they need to know, she said, when there's something good to tell them. Nathaniel set the 1806 journal beside her and went back to his correspondence files. But for a long time after that, the only sound in the room was the scratch of two pens moving across paper, working in the same direction. She found the letter at 7 o'clock. She almost missed it. It was filed inside the 1813 correspondence ledger, folded into a legal envelope, with a Richmond postmark, and addressed to Samuel Caldwell in a hand she recognized. Not from Thomas Harrington. She had been prepared for Thomas Harrington. It was from James Alderton, Nathaniel's father's trusted attorney of 30 years. She read it twice. Then she set it very carefully on the table. Nathaniel, she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. She heard it after she'd said it and felt briefly that she had crossed a line, but there was no graceful way to step back from it. He came to the table. He read the letter. She watched his face. In the letter dated October of 1814, 4 months before Samuel Caldwell died, James Alderton informed a colleague that he had identified 6 properties on the Caldwell estate, whose tenancy arrangements were informal enough to be legally challenged under a specific provision of Virginia property law, and that he was prepared to facilitate access to the estate records for the purpose of surveying those properties. The letter did not mention Whitfield by name. It did not mention Thomas Harrington by name. It mentioned a business arrangement with a partner in Richmond and a fair division of proceeds from any properties successfully reclaimed. It was on its own, not proof of anything that would satisfy a court. But it established that James Alderton had been planning this before Samuel Caldwell died. Before. Nathaniel put the letter down. He didn't speak for a long moment. When he did, his voice was very quiet. He was at my father's bedside, he said. He helped arrange the funeral. He told me my father had trusted him above any man he knew. He stopped. He was there for 30 years. Eleanor did not say she was sorry. She had learned that saying sorry in moments like this was sometimes a way of stepping back from them, and she didn't want to step back. He gave them everything they needed to do this, Nathaniel said. Yes, Eleanor said. And he made one mistake. What mistake? He put it in writing, Eleanor said. He was careful about everything else, but he wrote this letter, and your father, who was careful about everything, kept it. Nathaniel looked at her. Why would he keep it? Because I think your father suspected something, Eleanor said slowly. I think he received this letter and didn't know yet what it meant, but he felt something wrong in it, and he kept it the way cautious men keep things that don't sit right. She looked at the letter. He filed it in 1813 correspondence, not in Alderton's personal file, not in the property files. He hid it in plain sight, where it would take someone who knew his system to find it. Nathaniel was very still. He left it for someone to find, Nathaniel said. I think he left it in case it ever became necessary, Eleanor said. He didn't know when or how. He just kept it. Nathaniel sat down. He sat down in the way that men sat down when their legs had stopped cooperating, and their mind was somewhere else entirely, and Eleanor let him have the silence of it, which was the only useful thing she could give him in that moment. Outside, the Virginia summer evening had gone fully dark. Inside, on a table covered in 40 years of careful record-keeping, a dead man's caution had just changed everything. Eleanor picked up her pen and began to write. The letter from Alderton changed the tempo of everything. Eleanor spent the next 3 days barely sleeping. She worked through her father's correspondence files at home and Nathaniel's estate records at Caldwell, moving between the two, with the focused urgency of someone who understood that time was the one resource she could not recover once spent. 6 weeks to the court date had become 5. 5 had become 4 before she finished interviewing the last 2 families. Every conversation confirmed the same pattern. Whitfield. The boundary knowledge he shouldn't have had. The letters with Thomas Harrington's countersignature. And underneath all of it, invisible until you knew, to look the quiet machinery of James Alderton's betrayal, 30 years of trusted access, turned into a skeleton key that had opened every door the scheme required. What Eleanor had built by the end of the 3rd week was not yet a complete legal case. But it was something more valuable than that. It was a map. And a map her father had always said was how you knew which roads led somewhere and which ones were designed to make you walk in circles. She was standing at the Caldwell estate gate on a Tuesday morning, her satchel over one shoulder and a rolled survey map under her arm, when Nathaniel came out to meet her before Finch had a chance to. That was new. He had not done that before. "We have a problem," he said. Eleanor looked at his face. "What kind?" "Thomas Harrington was at the courthouse yesterday afternoon," Nathaniel said. "He filed a motion to accelerate the hearing. He's asking for the court date to be moved to 3 weeks from now." Eleanor absorbed that. "He knows we're building something. Someone told him." Nathaniel's voice was flat. "I don't know who, but someone in this county has been watching what we're doing and reporting back." Eleanor thought about the families she'd interviewed, the neighbors who had seen her arrive and leave the estate on multiple days, the courthouse clerk who had been present when Nathaniel requested copies of 3 land registry documents last week. Any one of a dozen ordinary interactions that had seemed unremarkable and now felt like open windows. 3 weeks, she said. "Can we be ready?" Eleanor calculated. Not quickly, carefully, the way she calculated everything. She had the altered survey and the original measurements from Samuel Caldwell's personal journals. She had Alderton's letter. She had the margin notation evidence linking Whitfield to Harrington and Associates. She had statements from 5 families identifying Whitfield and confirming his advanced knowledge of boundary specifics. She had Grover Finch's eyewitness account of the original Morton tenancy agreement. What she did not have was a direct evidentiary link between Thomas Harrington himself and the altered survey. Alderton's letter was damning, but it named no one specifically. Harrington's countersignature on the collection letters established his involvement in the debt collection scheme, but a skilled attorney could argue that he had signed collection documents in good faith, acting as a representative for a creditor he believed was legitimate. Thomas Harrington was many things. Foolish was not among them. He had kept himself exactly one clean step removed from the forgery itself. "We can be ready," Eleanor said, "if we get one more thing." "What thing?" "The original forged contracts were prepared by someone who physically altered your father's survey documents and then drafted new tenancy agreements based on those altered measurements," Eleanor said. "That physical work was done somewhere. It required original estate documents that were either copied or briefly removed. And someone who does that kind of careful, detailed legal drafting does not do it in one sitting." She looked at Nathaniel. "Whitfield has an office in Richmond. If those documents were prepared there, there will be evidence, drafts, reference copies, a record of the work." "Us. You want to search his office," Nathaniel said. "I want someone to look at what's in his office," Eleanor said carefully. "Your cousin Robert. He's in Richmond. He knows attorneys there. If Whitfield has ever had a business dispute, a disgruntled clerk, anyone who left his employ unhappily, that's the thread." Nathaniel was already thinking. She could see it the way his expression moved when he was working through something quicker and quieter than most people expected from a man who presented as still. "Robert sent a reply to my letter yesterday," Nathaniel said. Whitfield's name came up twice in connection with disputed estate cases in Henrico County. Both cases were settled before reaching court. Both families accepted terms significantly below the value of their property. "He's done this before," Eleanor said. "Yes, and Robert mentioned one other thing." Nathaniel paused. Whitfield had a clerk who left his employ 8 months ago. The man is currently working for a shipping firm in Richmond and is, according to Robert, not quiet about the reasons he left. Eleanor went still. "What is his name?" she said. "Marcus Webb," Nathaniel said. 26 years old, left Whitfield's office after refusing to notarize a document he believed was fraudulent. Whitfield told him he was confused about what he'd seen. Webb left the next day. The silence between them lasted exactly 2 seconds. "We need Marcus Webb," Eleanor said. "Robert is meeting with him tomorrow," Nathaniel said. "Tell Robert to ask him specifically about land survey documents," Eleanor said. "Ask if he ever saw survey maps from Hanover County. Ask if he was ever asked to copy measurements from one document to another. And ask him if he has anything in writing, anything at all from his time at Whitfield's office." "I'll write tonight," Nathaniel said. They went inside. The response from Robert Caldwell arrived in 4 days. Eleanor was at the estate when the letter came, and Nathaniel read it at the table without sitting down, which told her before he said a word that it was significant. "Webb kept copies," Nathaniel said. Eleanor set down her pen. "What kind of copies?" she said. "When he refused to notarize the document, he says it was a property transfer form for a parcel in Hanover County. Whitfield told him the matter was resolved and assigned him to other work. But Webb was uncomfortable enough that he made a copy of the original document before it disappeared from the files." Nathaniel looked up. "He hid it. He says he kept it because he didn't know what he might need one day, and because he had enough legal training to know that the measurements on that form did not match the form it was supposedly updating. He has an original draft of the altered survey transfer," Eleanor said. "With Whitfield's name on it," Nathaniel said. "And a notation in the margin." He paused. "In the Harrington and Associates shorthand." Eleanor stood up. She did it without thinking because her body made the decision before her mind finished processing it. She stood up and she put both hands flat on the table and she breathed. "That's the link," she said. "That connects Whitfield to the altered documents directly, and the shorthand connects that document to someone trained at Harrington's firm." She looked at Nathaniel. "Can Robert bring Webb to Hanover County before the hearing?" "He's asking that now," Nathaniel said. "Webb is willing to testify," he said, and Robert quoted him directly. Nathaniel looked at the letter. "I knew something was wrong with those papers. I should have done something sooner. I'd like the chance to do it now." Eleanor thought about a 26-year-old clerk who had looked at a fraudulent document and quietly made a copy and hidden it for 8 months, not knowing if it would ever matter, not knowing if anyone would ever ask. "Tell Robert to get him here," Eleanor said, "and tell him to keep it quiet." "Already done," Nathaniel said. He was looking at her across the table with the particular quality of attention she had come to recognize over the past weeks. Not the measuring look, not the assessment. Something more settled than that and more careful. "You knew there would be a Webb," he said. "Someone who'd seen too much and kept the evidence." "I hoped," Eleanor said. "There's usually someone. People who do this kind of work recruit other people to help them, and the people they recruit are not always as committed to the scheme as they are. Whitfield needed a clerk to process documents. He found one with a conscience." She paused. Thomas always underestimated people with consciences. He thought they were a liability. I think he was wrong. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "He underestimated you," he said. "Considerably," Eleanor agreed. 3 days before the hearing, Thomas Harrington came to Caldwell Estate. Eleanor was not there when he arrived. She was at the Harper farm, going over James Harper's recollection of Whitfield's visit for the 4th time, making certain every detail was consistent with what she'd put in the formal statement. She got back to the estate at mid-afternoon to find Finch waiting at the gate with an expression that was very carefully neutral. "Mr. Harrington called this morning," Finch said. "He spoke with Mr. Caldwell privately for approximately 40 minutes. Mr. Caldwell asked me to tell you when you arrived that he'd like to speak with you before you see anyone else." Eleanor went inside. Nathaniel was standing at the window when she entered the document room. He turned when she came in, and she read his face the way she had learned to read it over the past weeks, quickly, without fuss. He was angry. He was controlling it well, but the anger was there. "Tell me," she said. "He came to offer a settlement," Nathaniel said. "He said he was prepared to reduce the claimed debts to a quarter of the stated amount, allow the families to remain on their land under revised formal tenancy agreements, and withdraw the acceleration motion if I agreed to discontinue any legal challenge to the contract validity." Eleanor heard the shape of it. "He's scared. He's calculating," Nathaniel said. "He knows something has changed. He doesn't know exactly what, so he's offering enough to make the problem go away without offering enough to admit he did anything wrong." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd need to consider it," Nathaniel said, "because I needed to talk to you first." Eleanor looked at him. "You needed to talk to me first," she repeated. "This is your case as much as mine," Nathaniel said. "More in some ways. You found the evidence. You built the argument. You understood what these documents meant when every attorney I consulted couldn't see past the surface." He paused. "And whatever happens in that courtroom, the repercussions for you are different than the repercussions for me. I'm not making a decision about settlement without your input." Eleanor stood very still for a moment. In her 25 years of life, no one had ever said that to her. Not quite like that. Not with that particular combination of practicality and respect, the acknowledgement that her stakes were real, that her position mattered, that her word counted in a decision that affected her. She made herself focus. "If we accept the settlement," she said, "the families keep their land under Harrington's revised terms, which means he has formal tenancy agreements where none existed before, and he is now technically their landlord with all the leverage that implies." She paused. "They trade one bad contract for a better one, but they're still bound to him, and he walks away without consequence." "Yes," Nathaniel said, "and Whitfield walks away, and Alderton walks away, and the next county where they find informal tenancy arrangements and cooperative attorneys, they do it again." "Yes," Nathaniel said. "Then there's nothing to consider," Eleanor said. "We don't settle." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "I was hoping you'd say that." "Were you uncertain?" "No," he said, "but I wanted it to be your decision to make, not mine." She held that for a second. "Send word to Harrington that you've considered his offer and declined," she said. Thomas Harrington's response came the next morning. Not in writing. In person. He arrived without Whitfield, without an attorney, without any of the careful apparatus of professional legitimacy he had presented at every prior interaction. He arrived alone, and he came to the Whitmore house, not to Caldwell Estate, and he knocked on the front door at 8 in the morning. Eleanor answered it herself because her aunt was at the market. She and Thomas Harrington looked at each other across the doorstep for a moment in the early morning light. He had the expression of a man who has decided to try a strategy he is not entirely comfortable with. She recognized it. She had seen it before in the weeks before he ended their engagement, when he had tried several times to redirect her attention away from the trade documents he'd asked her to review. "Eleanor," he said. "Thomas," she said. "May I come in?" "No," she said pleasantly. He absorbed that. "I'd like to speak with you privately." "You're speaking with me privately right now," she said. "There's no one else here." He looked past her into the house, checking she understood whether Nathaniel was there. He wasn't, but the fact that Thomas had checked told her something useful about his current state of mind. "This has gone further than necessary," Thomas said. "You know that." "Has it?" Eleanor said. "You're a clever woman. I've always said so." His voice had taken on a particular warmth that she recognized as the voice he used when he wanted something, not the cold dismissal of the sitting room, but the engaged, attentive version of himself that he deployed when he had decided charm was the better tool. "You've done something impressive with these documents. I don't dispute that. But the families involved were always going to be compensated fairly. The original intent of the arrangement—" "Thomas," Eleanor said. He stopped. "I know about Marcus Webb," she said. The warmth left his face. It happened quickly, just a flicker, a fraction of a second, where the performance dropped, and something colder and more real moved behind his eyes. Then it was gone, and the warmth was back, but it was a different warmth now. Tighter, more careful. "I don't know that name," he said. "You don't need to know it," Eleanor said. "You only need to know that he kept copies." Thomas was very still. "Whatever you think you have, I know what I have," Eleanor said. "I've known what I had for 10 days. I've been building the argument to present it correctly because I intend to present it in a way that holds up in a county courtroom before a judge and a full gallery, not in a way that gets dismissed on a procedural question." She looked at him directly. "You came here because you were hoping I was afraid, or that I could be persuaded, or that I had some remaining feeling for you that you could use." She paused. "I did have feelings for you, Thomas. I believed for a long time that you were a better man than you chose to be. That was my mistake, and I've made my peace with it." Thomas's jaw tightened. "You're going to destroy a great deal," he said, and the warmth was entirely gone now. "My family's name, Alderton's reputation, Whitfield's practice. For what? For 6 farms that would have been compensated. For 6 families who built those farms with their hands over 40 years, Eleanor said. And for every other family in 3 counties who would have been next." "You can't know that. I know you," Eleanor said. "I reviewed your trade documents for 2 years. I know how you think. I know the difference between a system you build to serve a single purpose and a system you build because you intend to use it again." He looked at her for a long moment. In that look she saw briefly clearly the thing she had always sensed beneath his careful surface. Not stupidity. Thomas Harrington was not stupid. What she saw was the particular kind of fear that came from being a man who had always believed his intelligence was the most valuable thing in any room, confronting the possibility that he had been wrong about that. "You should have stayed quiet," he said. "Probably," Eleanor agreed. "I've been told that most of my life. I haven't been very good at it." He left. 10. The night before the hearing, Eleanor sat in her father's study with his 1809 survey notes and his agricultural law journals and his 30 years of correspondence laid out around her, and she went through the full case one final time. She had done this every night for a week. Not because she doubted the evidence was solid, built carefully enough that it could survive examination from any direction. She did it because she wanted to know it the way she knew language. Not just the meaning of each word, but the rhythm of it, the weight of it, the way it felt when you spoke it aloud to someone who needed to understand. The hearing tomorrow would not be a quiet room of documents. It would be Thomas Harrington's attorneys and Thomas Harrington's witnesses and the accumulated weight of Thomas Harrington's family name, all of it pointed at her, with the specific intention of making her seem like a rejected woman with a personal grievance and a collection of coincidences she had mistaken for evidence. She knew that. She had known it from the beginning. What she also knew, what she had always known, was that the evidence didn't care about any of that. Documents were not impressed by family names. Numbers did not rearrange themselves out of social courtesy. Ink was ink, and a different nib width was a different nib width, and a dead man's personal journals said what they said, regardless of who was in the room. She heard footsteps on the path outside, then a knock at the study door, which was unusual because no one came to the study except her. She opened it. Nathaniel Caldwell was standing on the path in the summer dark with his hat in his hand. "Finch told me you'd likely be here," he said. "I hope I'm not—" "You're not," Eleanor said. She stepped back. He came inside, looked at the papers spread across the desk the way a person looked at something that was clearly the product of a great deal of concentrated work. "How are you feeling about tomorrow?" he asked. Prepared, Eleanor said, and aware that prepared doesn't mean certain. No, he said, it doesn't. Are you worried? She asked. He stopped, started again. I've been thinking about something you said, the day you came to the estate the first time. You said you'd spent your life absorbing consequences for being who you are. He looked at her. Tomorrow you're going to walk into a room full of people who have already decided what you are, and you're going to stand there and make them reconsider. Yes, Eleanor said. And if it works, he said, a great deal changes, for the families, for the estate, for the county. He paused. And if it doesn't? If it doesn't, Eleanor said, we appeal. And we keep appealing. Because the evidence doesn't change regardless of what any particular judge decides to do with it. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. I want to say something, he said, and I want to say it now before tomorrow, so that it's clear it's not contingent on the outcome. Eleanor waited. I don't know many people, he said, who are exactly who they are in every room, in every situation, regardless of who's watching. My father was one of them. I've been trying to be one of them and finding it harder than I expected. He looked at her steadily. You are one of them. I noticed it the first day. I've been thinking about very little else since. Eleanor held very still. She had become over the past weeks practiced at parsing what Nathaniel Caldwell meant when he said things, at reading the gap between his careful words and what the careful words were trying to carry. She was reading that gap now. That is a great deal to say the night before a county hearing, she said. I know, he said. I said it tonight on purpose. Because tomorrow you're going to walk into that room for the families and for justice, and for every reason I've watched you work yourself to exhaustion for 4 weeks. He paused. I wanted you to know that someone in that room will be there for you. Eleanor looked at him. The lamplight was doing something uncomplicated to the room, the warm kind of light that made everything look like a decision rather than an accident. Thank you, she said. It was not enough. She knew it was not enough. But it was honest, and it was what she had, and Nathaniel seemed to understand that, because he nodded once, put his hat back on, and said good night. She listened to his footsteps fade down the path. Then she turned back to her father's papers. She had 3 more hours of work before she would let herself sleep, and she intended to use every one of them. Tomorrow she was going to walk into a room that had already decided who she was. And she was going to prove every single one of them wrong. The hearing was set for 9 o'clock. Eleanor arrived at 8. She came alone, which her aunt had protested and which Eleanor had insisted upon, because she did not want to arrive at the Hanover County Courthouse as someone who needed accompanying. She carried her father's satchel with the full case documentation organized in the exact sequence she intended to present it, and she walked through the front door with the particular kind of stillness that was not the absence of fear, but the decision to move through it anyway. The room was already filling. That was the first thing she registered. She had expected an administrative hearing, a judge, the attorneys, the affected families, a clerk. What she found instead was a room that had clearly been talked about. Merchants she recognized from the county market. Neighboring landowners. 3 women from the social circle that had been present in her sitting room the morning Thomas ended their engagement, sitting together in the second row, with the alert expressions of people who had come to watch something they expected to be interesting. Reverend Aldgate was there in the front row, attended by a younger man who appeared to be helping him stay upright. He was 80 years old, and he had made the journey from his retirement cottage 6 miles away because Eleanor had asked him to, and the sight of him sitting there with his hands folded over his cane did something to her chest that she didn't have time to examine. James and Ruth Harper were there. The Mortons. All 6 families represented in full arranged along the left side of the room with the quiet solidarity of people who had discussed how to sit together and decided to do it visibly. Nathaniel was already at the respondents' table. He caught her eye when she entered and gave her a single nod that said everything it needed to say without saying any of it aloud. Marcus Webb sat behind the respondents' table, his hands clasped in his lap, his expression that of a young man who was frightened and had decided to be there anyway. Eleanor had met him twice in the past 4 days. He was precise in his recollections, honest about what he didn't remember, and possessed of the particular moral clarity that came from having made a right decision alone and in private, and having had to live with the uncertainty of whether it had mattered. It had mattered. Thomas Harrington arrived at 8:55 with 2 attorneys and James Alderton. Eleanor had not known Alderton would be there. She felt the room shift when he came in, a murmur, a reorientation of attention, and she understood immediately that his presence was a calculated choice. He was 68 years old and had the distinguished appearance of a man whose respectability was his primary professional asset. Thomas was using him as a character witness and a shield simultaneously. She filed that adjustment and did not let it show on her face. The judge was a man named Harold Prescott, 60 years old, with the reputation of someone who was genuinely impartial and genuinely impatient with proceedings that wasted his time. Eleanor had researched him carefully. He had ruled in favor of tenant farmers over landowners in 2 previous property disputes. He had also ruled against them in 3 others, and in each case where he had ruled against them, the evidence had been circumstantial. She had made certain her evidence was not circumstantial. Caldwell versus Whitfield and associated parties, Prescott said. I've reviewed the submitted documentation. Before we begin, I want to be clear that this hearing will determine whether the contracts presented to 6 tenant families on Caldwell Estate are valid and enforceable. Nothing else is before this court today. He looked at both tables. Counsel, are we ready? Thomas Harrington's lead attorney, a Richmond man named Forsyth, whom Eleanor had looked up and found to have an excellent record in property cases, stood immediately. The claimant is ready, Your Honor. Nathaniel's attorney, a Hanover County man named Price, who was methodical rather than brilliant, but trusted Eleanor's case completely because she had walked him through it 3 times and answered every question he raised, said the same. Then let's begin, Prescott said. Forsyth opened for 45 minutes. Eleanor listened to every word. He was good. She had expected him to be good, and he was. He presented the contracts as straightforward instruments of legitimate debt recovery. He established Thomas Harrington as a reputable businessman acting in his professional capacity as a creditor representative. He described Samuel Whitfield as a licensed Virginia attorney of good standing. He built a picture of a routine legal matter being complicated by a respondent, Nathaniel Caldwell, who had chosen to challenge valid documents rather than honor his late father's financial obligations. He did not mention Eleanor by name once. That was the tell. If he had believed she was irrelevant, he would have ignored her entirely. The fact that he carefully avoided naming her while constructing an argument designed to neutralize her evidence before she had presented it told her that she was precisely what he was most concerned about. When Forsyth finished, Price stood and stated the respondent's position in clear, plain language. The contracts were fraudulent. The families had been targeted deliberately, and the evidence to support those claims would be presented through documentary analysis and witness testimony. Then he sat down. Then he turned to Eleanor, because that had been the arrangement they'd agreed to. Price would establish the legal framework. Eleanor would present the evidence. It was unusual. Price had been uncertain about it. Eleanor had explained once that she was the only person in the county who understood the full evidentiary chain in the sequence required to make it comprehensible to a judge, and Price had considered that for 2 days before conceding she was right. She stood up. The room noticed. She felt it not hostility exactly, but attention with weight behind it. The 3 women from the second row. The merchants. Forsyth, who had picked up his pen. Your Honor, Eleanor said. With the court's permission, I'll be presenting the documentary evidence on behalf of the respondent. Prescott looked at her over his reading glasses. You are Miss Whitmore? Yes, sir. You're not an attorney? No, sir. I'm a scholar of agricultural law and property documentation. I am presenting documentary evidence, not legal argument. Mr. Price will handle the legal argument. Prescott considered her for a moment. Forsyth was on his feet instantly. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Most things worth doing are, Prescott said mildly. Sit down, Mr. Forsyth. Miss Whitmore, proceed. She started with the ink. It was the right place to start because it was concrete, visual, and unarguable. She placed the altered 1809 survey before the court and walked Judge Prescott through the specific characteristics of two different ink samples in the same document. The original measurements in a lighter iron gall ink consistent with documents from that period, and the corrections in a marginally darker ink with a different nib width that placed them no earlier than 1814. She had brought a magnifying lens. She offered it to the judge. Prescott took it, looked and said nothing for a full 10 seconds. Forsyth said, "Your Honor, this is a subjective interpretation of document aging." "I can see two different inks," Prescott said. "Continue, Miss Whitmore." She continued. She laid the original measurements from Samuel Caldwell's 1809 personal journal beside the altered survey and walked through each discrepancy in exact terms. Not large numbers, not dramatic differences, but precise and documented, and directly tied to the creation of the disputed land parcel that the forged contracts claimed as the basis for the debt. Then she placed Alderton's letter on the table. She did not read it aloud. She let Prescott read it himself, which was a choice she had made deliberately because a judge reading something in his own time was a different thing from an attorney reading it at him. Prescott read it twice. His expression did not change, but something around his eyes shifted. "This letter was in Samuel Caldwell's personal files," Prescott asked. "Filed in his 1813 correspondence ledger," Eleanor said, "in a section otherwise containing routine county correspondence." "Why would he file it there?" "I believe he filed it there because he was uncertain what it meant but did not want to discard it," Eleanor said. "Samuel Caldwell was a systematic man. Things that didn't fit went into general files so they could be found later if context arrived." She paused. "Context has arrived." In the second row, one of the women from the sitting room morning leaned toward her neighbor and said something too quiet to hear. Eleanor did not look at them. Forsyth cross-examined her for 35 minutes. He was skilled, and she had expected that too. He challenged the ink analysis as subjective. He challenged the journal measurements as self-serving family records. He challenged the interpretation of Alderton's letter as speculation, dressed as evidence. He was precise and professional, and he hit every weak point in the case with accurate aim. Eleanor answered every question. She answered them the way she had answered her father's questions when she was 12 years old, and he was teaching her to defend an argument, not by retreating, not by hedging, but by distinguishing clearly between what she knew and what she inferred, and what the evidence established independent of her interpretation. At the 20-minute mark, Forsyth shifted. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and his voice changed in a specific way that she recognized as the pivot she had been waiting for. "You were formerly engaged to Mr. Thomas Harrington." "Yes," she said. "And that engagement ended approximately 4 months ago." "Yes." "At Mr. Harrington's initiation." "Yes." "And you became involved in this case at Mr. Caldwell's invitation how long after that ending?" 6 weeks. Forsyth let the room do the arithmetic. He was good enough to let silence work for him. "So you are asking this court to accept documentary analysis from a woman who was rejected by the man at the center of these accusations, 6 weeks after that rejection, working under the patronage of that man's primary business adversary." The room shifted. Eleanor felt it, the reorientation, the doubt, the way a room full of people reconsidered what they'd been watching. She waited until the shift had fully settled. Then she said, "Mr. Forsyth, are you suggesting that the ink in this survey changed color because I was rejected? That Samuel Caldwell's personal journals rewrote their own measurements to accommodate my feelings? That Marcus Webb kept his copies for 8 months in anticipation of my emotional state?" Someone in the room made a sound that was almost laughter and caught itself. Prescott's expression did not change, but he set his pen down. "The evidence I've presented is documentary," Eleanor continued. "It exists independent of my relationship to any party in this room. If Mr. Forsyth can demonstrate that the measurements in Samuel Caldwell's 1809 journal were fabricated, or that the ink differential in the altered survey is an illusion, or that Alderton's letter was placed in those files by someone other than Samuel Caldwell himself, I welcome that demonstration." She looked directly at Forsyth. "But personal motivation is not a counter-argument to physical evidence. It is a substitute for one." Forsyth looked at her for a long moment. He said, "No further questions." Marcus Webb took the stand after noon. He was nervous. Eleanor had told him he would be nervous and that it would not matter, as long as he said what he knew in the order he knew it, and he had nodded with the expression of someone who was not entirely convinced, but was going to try. He was asked to describe his employment with Samuel Whitfield and the specific document that had prompted his resignation. He described it clearly: a property transfer form referencing a Hanover County survey. Measurements he had been asked to copy from one document onto a new form. Margin notations already present on the original that he had been told were filing codes. "Can you describe those notations?" Price asked. "They were a shorthand system," Webb said. "I'd seen it before in documents from Harrington and Associates when we processed paperwork coming from their firm." Forsyth objected. Prescott overruled. "And the copy you retained," Price said, "is this document." Webb looked at the paper placed before him. "Yes, sir. That's my copy." "And the original document this was copied from, do you know what happened to it?" "Mr. Whitfield removed it from the files the week after I left," Webb said. "I know because a colleague still at the firm told me." Then Price said, "Mr. Webb, did Mr. Whitfield ever mention the name Thomas Harrington in connection with the Hanover County work?" Webb paused. Eleanor at the table did not breathe. "Yes," Webb said. "Once. I heard him on 2 occasions. He didn't know I could hear from the outer office speaking to someone by letter dictation. He referred to the recipient twice as Mr. H and once by full name. He said, and I remember this specifically because it was the day before I saw the document, he said, 'Mr. Harrington will be satisfied with the Hanover measurements. The boundary work is done.'" The room went very quiet. Then James Harper said from the left side of the room, not loudly but clearly, "Lord Almighty." Prescott did not reprimand him. Forsyth requested a recess. Prescott granted 15 minutes. During those 15 minutes, Eleanor sat at the respondent's table and did not look at Thomas Harrington. She was aware of him. She was always aware of him, in rooms the way you were aware of weather, but she kept her attention on her papers, on the sequence of what remained on the questions she could still anticipate. Nathaniel sat beside her. "You're steady," he said quietly. "I want you to know that I see that." "I am terrified," Eleanor said equally quietly. "I know," he said. "You're steady anyway. That's what matters." She almost said something. She wasn't sure what something that would have been too large for the moment and would have had to be unraveled later. She pressed it back down and returned to her papers. When Forsyth returned, he called James Alderton to the stand. That was the moment Eleanor had feared most. Alderton was 68 years old and had the natural authority of a man who had spent 4 decades being believed. He denied writing the letter. He said he had no memory of it. He suggested that the letter had been fabricated, and here he looked briefly at Eleanor by parties motivated to discredit a legitimate legal process. He was believable. That was the difficult truth. He was old and distinguished, and his voice carried weight, and Eleanor watched several faces in the room move back toward uncertainty, and felt the case she had built with 4 weeks of careful work wobble on its foundation. Prescott asked, "Mr. Alderton, do you deny that the handwriting in this letter is yours?" "I do deny it," Alderton said, firmly. Prescott nodded slowly, turned to Price. "Do you have a handwriting witness?" Price looked at Eleanor. Eleanor stood. "Your Honor, I'd ask the court's permission to place before Mr. Alderton 3 documents from the Caldwell estate, records his 1810 correspondence with Samuel Caldwell regarding the East Boundary Survey." his 1812 letter recommending Samuel Whitfield for the legal review, and his 1808 notation in the property ledger margin. All three are in his established hand. Forsyth was on his feet. Your Honor, the witness has made a factual claim that his handwriting does not appear in the disputed letter, Prescott said. Miss Whitmore is offering comparative samples. That is a legitimate evidentiary response. Sit down. Eleanor placed the three documents before Alderton. She placed the disputed letter beside them. She did not say a word. She simply let him look at them. The room watched James Alderton look at 4 pieces of paper for 8 seconds that lasted considerably longer than 8 seconds. His attorney leaned toward him and said something too quiet to hear. Alderton said nothing. Mr. Alderton, Prescott said, do you wish to revise your testimony? The silence stretched. Then, in a voice that had lost most of its authority, I would like to consult with my attorney. The room understood what that meant before Prescott said it. We'll take a 30-minute recess, Prescott said. They did not need 30 minutes. In 20, Alderton's attorney approached Price with a written statement. Eleanor read it over Price's shoulder. Alderton confirmed that he had written the letter. He stated that he had been approached by Thomas Harrington in the summer of 1814 with a proposal he had been persuaded to consider that he had facilitated Whitfield's access to the Caldwell estate records, and that he deeply regretted his actions. He did not say that under coercion. He said it because the alternative perjury charges on top of everything else had clearly become visible to him in the preceding 20 minutes. Eleanor handed the statement back to Price. She sat down. Her hands, she discovered, were not shaking. She found that notable. When the hearing resumed, Prescott read the statement into the record. Then he looked at Forsyth. Forsyth stood, sat down, stood again. Your Honor, he said, the claimant requests a continuance. On what grounds? Prescott asked. New evidence has. The new evidence came from your client's associate, Prescott said. I'm not granting a continuance to allow time to construct a different story. The documentary evidence has been established. A key witness has revised testimony that was demonstrably false. We are going to conclude today. He looked at both tables. Is there anything further before I deliberate? Forsyth said nothing. Price looked at Eleanor. Eleanor stood. Your Honor, she said, I'd ask the court to note for the record that the families affected by these contracts have farmed this land for periods ranging from 22 to 41 years. They came to this hearing without attorneys and without certainty that the law would see what had been done to them. They came because they had nothing else to come with. She paused. The evidence establishes fraud, but I'd ask the court to also consider that the purpose of this fraud was not only profit. It was the removal of families who had no formal documentation to protect themselves and who were chosen specifically for that vulnerability. She set her notes down. They should not have needed a document to be safe. But they needed one, and they didn't have one, and someone used that against them. A pause. I'd ask the court to see that clearly. Prescott looked at her for a moment. I see it clearly, Miss Whitmore, he said. You've made certain of that. He deliberated for 40 minutes. When he returned, the room had filled with a kind of held breath that Eleanor had never experienced in any other setting, the specific suspension of normal human noise that happened when something genuinely consequential was about to be decided, and everyone present understood it. The contracts presented to the 6 tenant families of Caldwell Estate are hereby declared null and void on grounds of fraud, Prescott said. The survey alterations constitute criminal tampering with legal records. I am referring the matter of Samuel Whitfield and James Alderton to the Commonwealth's attorney for prosecution. I am further directing that Thomas Harrington appear before this court within 30 days to address his role in the preparation and distribution of fraudulent collection documents. He set down his papers. The families will retain their land, he said, unconditionally. James Harper made a sound that was not a word in any of the 7 languages Eleanor knew. It didn't need to be. It was the sound a man made when 41 years of work had just been told it was real, and it was his, and no one could take it. Ruth Harper pressed both hands over her mouth. Clara Morton put her head on her husband's shoulder and cried without any apparent effort to stop. Eleanor sat very still and let it move through her, the weeks of work, the 4 a.m. sessions in her father's study, the morning Thomas had stood in her sitting room and performed his verdict for an audience of Tea Party guests, and all the years before that, when she had carried 7 languages and a scholar's mind through a world that had consistently told her both were inconvenient. She let all of it move through her. Then she picked up her satchel. Thomas Harrington was already gone. She had not seen him leave. One moment he had been at the claimant's table, and then the room had shifted, and he was not there anymore. And Eleanor found that she had nothing to feel about his absence, except a mild, distant recognition that his exit was exactly the kind of thing he would do. Perform confidence until the performance became impossible, then leave before anyone could watch him reckon with the consequence. She walked to where the 6 families were gathered near the left wall. James Harper saw her coming and stepped forward and put out his hand. "Miss Whitmore," he said. Eleanor shook it. "Thank you," he said, "for all of it, for coming every day, for knowing what you knew." He stopped because he was a man who was better with physical work than with words, and the gratitude he was trying to express was larger than the vocabulary he was comfortable with. "My father built that farm. I was born on it. My son—" He stopped again. "I know," Eleanor said. "I know." Ruth Harper touched Eleanor's arm briefly quietly and didn't say anything, and that was somehow more than anything she could have said. Eleanor walked back toward the respondents' table to collect her documents. Nathaniel was standing there waiting. He didn't speak immediately. He let her collect the papers in their proper sequence because he had learned over 4 weeks of working alongside her that she needed to finish what she was doing before she could be present for anything else. When she had the satchel closed, she looked up. He was looking at her with an expression she didn't quite have a category for, something beyond respect, something that had weight and warmth in it simultaneously. And that was, she understood, not a new thing. It had been there for weeks, building in the spaces between document reviews and late evening coffee and conversations that had started about evidence and ended somewhere neither of them had planned to go. "You did it," he said. "We did it," Eleanor said. "Your father did it by being the kind of man who kept everything." "You found what he kept," Nathaniel said. "That's not nothing. That's the whole thing." Eleanor looked at the room, at the families still gathered near the wall, at Reverend Aldgate, being helped carefully to his feet by his attendant, at the clerk gathering documents from the judge's table, at the ordinary machinery of a county proceeding, returning to its normal pace, now that the extraordinary thing it had hosted was finished. "My father would have liked this," she said. "He would have liked knowing his notes were good for something." "His notes produced this," Nathaniel said. "His notes and his daughter," Eleanor said, which was not something she had planned to say, and which came out with more simplicity than she expected. As though it were just a fact. As though it did not carry 25 years of being told it wasn't true. Nathaniel heard it. She could tell from the way he went briefly still, the way he did when something mattered enough to hold carefully. "Yes," he said. His notes and his daughter. Outside, the Virginia summer was at full heat, the kind of afternoon that turned everything gold and slow, and Eleanor Whitmore walked out of the Hanover County Courthouse into it with her father's satchel on her shoulder and 6 families who still had their homes, and a man she had come to trust more completely than she had trusted anyone in years, walking quietly beside her. The work was not finished. Whitfield and Alderton still faced prosecution. Thomas Harrington had 30 days and a summons and whatever remained of his careful calculations. The county had a fraud scheme to untangle and records to correct and a legal process that would require careful attention for months. But the families had their land, and Eleanor Whitmore, who had spent 25 years being told that everything she knew was either useless or inappropriate, had just stood in a room full of powerful people and made them see the truth. That was not everything, but it was enough to begin with. The 30 days following the hearing were not quiet. Eleanor had not expected them to be quiet. She had understood walking out of that courthouse in the July heat that a verdict was not the same thing as a conclusion. A verdict was a door opening onto a great deal of work that still needed doing, and the work did not pause to let anyone celebrate. Thomas Harrington appeared before Judge Prescott on day 28, not day 30, day 28, 2 days early, which Eleanor read correctly as the action of a man who had spent 4 weeks calculating his best remaining position and had decided that voluntary early appearance was preferable to the optics of showing up at the last possible moment. It was exactly the kind of careful, face-saving calculation she had come to expect from him, and it was exactly the kind of thing that no longer had any power to surprise her. She was not in the courtroom for that appearance. She had not been asked to be, and she had not asked to be. Her part in the legal proceedings had been completed. What happened to Thomas Harrington now was between him and the Commonwealth, and Eleanor had learned was still learning the discipline of knowing where her work ended. What she heard afterward from Price was this. Thomas had appeared with a Richmond attorney of considerable reputation and had entered into a negotiated agreement. He acknowledged his role in facilitating the fraudulent collection scheme. He did not acknowledge directing the original forgery that his attorneys argued successfully remained unproven beyond Alderton's testimony and Webb's second-hand account of a letter dictation. He agreed to substantial financial restitution to the 6 families. He agreed to surrender his business licensing in Hanover County and 2 adjacent counties. He did not go to prison. Eleanor sat with that for a day. Then she went back to work. Because Samuel Whitfield's prosecution was still proceeding, and Whitfield, unlike Thomas, had no family name significant enough to negotiate a clean exit, and Marcus Webb was the Commonwealth's primary witness, and Webb was 26 years old and had never testified in a criminal proceeding, and needed someone to help him organize his recollections into a form that would survive cross-examination. Eleanor spent 3 days with Marcus Webb at her father's kitchen table, going through his account in the same methodical sequence she had used with the 6 families. What he knew, when he knew it, how he knew it. The distinction between what he had seen with his own eyes and what he had inferred. The document he had kept and exactly where he had kept it and why. By the end of the 3rd day, Webb looked at her across the table with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "can I ask you something that isn't about the case?" "You can try," she said. "Why are you helping me?" he said. "Not I understand why you helped the families, that's clear. But I'm the one who waited 8 months before saying anything. I could have come forward sooner. I didn't because I was scared, and because of it, those families had to live with those notices for almost a year." He paused. "You don't owe me any of this." Eleanor looked at him. "You kept the copy," she said, "when it would have been much easier not to. When no one was asking you to, when you had no guarantee it would ever matter when keeping it was a risk and letting it disappear was safe." She paused. "That's not a small thing, Mr. Webb. That's the whole case." "I almost threw it away twice," he said. "But you didn't," Eleanor said. Webb was quiet for a moment. "My mother would have," he said, "thrown it away. She always said you had to be practical about what battles you could win." "What do you think?" Eleanor asked. He thought about it genuinely, which she appreciated. "I think," he said finally, "that sometimes you don't know which battles you can win until someone else shows up who knows how to fight them." Eleanor looked at her notes. "That," she said, "is a reasonable conclusion." Whitfield's trial was set for October. In August, he attempted to have the case transferred to Richmond on grounds that he could not receive a fair hearing in Hanover County. The motion was denied. In September, he filed a challenge to the admissibility of Webb's copied document. That was denied as well. Eleanor learned about both denials from Price, who had developed the habit of sending her brief written summaries of procedural developments as though she were a colleague rather than a civilian who had assisted with one case. She found she appreciated the updates more than she would have predicted, and she was honest enough with herself to understand why. This had been her work. She had built it. She wanted to know what happened to it. In September, 6 weeks after the hearing, Nathaniel came to the Whitmore house on a Tuesday afternoon with a proposal that was not the proposal Eleanor had been quietly half anticipating and half dreading for the past month. It was a different kind of proposal entirely, and it was both better and more complicated than she had expected. He sat in her father's parlor, not the sitting room where Thomas had performed his verdict, but the smaller room at the back that had always felt more like the real house, and he set a document on the table. "The Caldwell estate records need a permanent administrator," he said. "Not a clerk, not a copying service. Someone who understands the full scope of the documentation, who can maintain the integrity of the filing system, and who has the legal and agricultural knowledge to identify problems before they become crises." He looked at her. "I'm offering you the position, with a formal contract, your name on the agreement, your own office in the estate house, compensation appropriate to the responsibility." Eleanor looked at the document. "That's not a small offer," she said. "It's not meant to be small," Nathaniel said. "It's meant to be accurate. The work you did in August was worth more to this estate than I can fully calculate. The least I can do is offer you a position that reflects what you're actually capable of rather than what a county full of people have decided to believe about you." Eleanor looked at the contract, read it again. Her name was already on it in the correct line in the right place. "I want one change," she said. "Tell me. I want a provision that allows me to take on independent consulting work for other property owners in the county," she said. "Not in conflict with Caldwell estate interests, but there are families throughout this area who have the same vulnerabilities the 6 families had: informal arrangements, no documentation, no one who knows how to read the contracts being used against them." She looked at him. "I want to be able to help them." Nathaniel did not hesitate. "I'll have Price add the language today." Eleanor set the contract down. "There's something else," Nathaniel said. She looked at him. "I've been thinking about what you said," he said the night before the hearing, "about how you'd spent your whole life absorbing consequences for being who you are." "I remember," Eleanor said. "I've been carrying something similar," he said. "Different shape, same weight. My father's estate, his expectations, the responsibility of being the Caldwell who didn't fail when it mattered." He paused. "For a long time I managed that weight by keeping everyone at a distance. It was efficient. It was also, I understand now, a way of making certain no one ever saw when the weight was too much." Eleanor said nothing. She let him finish. "You walked into my document room 6 weeks ago, and within 2 hours you had found things I hadn't been able to find in 18 months, he said. "Not because you're smarter than me, though you may be, and I'm comfortable with that, but because you weren't carrying the weight of what failure would mean. You could just look at what was actually there." He paused again. "I'd like to be around someone who sees things clearly, on a more permanent basis." The room was very quiet. "Nathaniel," Eleanor said. "I'm not asking you for an answer today," he said immediately. "I understand that I am a man with a complicated estate and a recently disrupted county reputation, and approximately 4 decades of learned emotional reserve. I am not an uncomplicated prospect." "No," Eleanor said. "You're not." "I'm asking you to know that the offer exists," he said. "The position at the estate exists regardless of anything else. I want to be clear that those are separate things." "I know they're separate," Eleanor said. "I can tell the difference between a man who is offering me work as a courtship strategy and a man who genuinely needs someone to manage his records." "Which am I?" Nathaniel asked. Eleanor looked at him directly. "Both," she said, "but in the correct order." Something shifted in his expression, the careful reserve moving aside for just a moment, something warmer and less managed underneath. "The correct order," he repeated. "The position first," Eleanor said, "because it's the right position, and I'm the right person for it, and it needs to exist independent of everything else." She paused. "Everything else can find its own pace." "That seems reasonable," Nathaniel said. "Most things I say are reasonable," Eleanor said. "You'll get used to it." He laughed. It was not a social laugh, not the polished, appropriate variety she had heard him produce in professional settings. It was a genuine laugh, slightly surprised, and she discovered she liked the sound of it considerably more than she had anticipated. 1. She started at Caldwell Estate on the 1st of October. Her office was the East Records Room, which had been cleared of the crisis documents and reorganized into a working space. There was a proper desk. There was shelf space for her father's reference materials, which she brought from home in 3 careful trips over 2 days. There was a window that faced the back garden, which she had been told she could ignore or acknowledge as she preferred. She spent the first week doing something no one had done to the Caldwell records in 30 years. She started at the beginning. Every document, every ledger, every survey, every correspondence file. She cataloged everything that existed, cross-referenced it against the index system she was building, and flagged anything that required further examination. It was slow, systematic work, and she did it with the same focused attention she brought to everything that mattered, which was everything she chose to do. By the end of the second week, Finch came to the door of the East Records Room on a Thursday afternoon with a question about a 1804 land transfer, and she answered it from memory without looking up from what she was working on, and Finch stood there for a moment before saying, "You know, Mr. Caldwell's father used to do that, answer questions without looking up." Eleanor did look up at that. "Did he?" she said. "It used to make the staff nervous," Finch said, "until they understood it meant he knew everything. After that it was reassuring." He paused. "I thought you'd want to know it has the same effect." Eleanor returned to her work, but she was smiling. In the second week of October, Whitfield's trial began. Eleanor attended every session. She sat in the gallery, not at any table, and she watched Marcus Webb take the stand on the second day with the composure of someone who had been very well prepared, and who had, Eleanor suspected, also simply grown into the situation over the preceding months. He answered every question clearly. He produced the copied document. He described what he had seen and what he had inferred, and the distinction between them, and he did it with the precise honesty of someone who understood that the truth was strong enough to carry the case without embellishment. Whitfield's attorney tried the same approach Forsyth had tried with Eleanor. Motivation, credibility. The implication that a disgruntled former employee was not a reliable witness. Webb looked at the attorney and said with remarkable steadiness, "I kept that document for 8 months before anyone asked me about it. If I were motivated by personal grievance, I had 8 months to do something with it, and I didn't. I waited until someone found me." The attorney didn't have a clean answer for that. Whitfield was convicted on 2 counts of document fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to defraud. He was sentenced to 18 months and a permanent suspension of his legal license. When the verdict was read, Eleanor sat very still in the gallery and let herself feel the complete shape of it. Not triumph exactly, something quieter than triumph. The particular satisfaction of work that had been done correctly arriving at the outcome it deserved. She walked out into the October afternoon. Nathaniel was waiting outside, which she had not told him to do, and which did not surprise her. "Well," he said. "Convicted," she said. He let out a breath. Not dramatically, just the quiet release of something that had been held a long time. "Good," he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "Good." They stood side by side in the October light for a moment. "Your father would have been proud of you," Nathaniel said. "I find myself wishing I'd known him." "He would have enjoyed arguing with you," Eleanor said. "He enjoyed arguing with anyone who had read enough to hold their own." "I'd have held my own," Nathaniel said. "Probably," Eleanor said. "He would have liked that." The school opened in November. It had been Eleanor's idea stated plainly to Nathaniel in late September, a small school meeting twice a week at the Caldwell estate for the daughters of the farming families, reading mathematics and basic property and contract literacy. Not charity, she was specific about that distinction. Knowledge offered in the same spirit her father had offered it to her. Because knowledge that stayed in one family's library was not doing what knowledge was supposed to do, Nathaniel had said without hesitation. "Use the south parlor. I'll have it set up." She had not expected that it would come together quickly. She had expected months of negotiation, of persuading families to send their daughters, of overcoming the reasonable suspicion that a wealthy estate's generosity always cost something. What she had not fully accounted for was Ruth Harper. Ruth Harper, who had pressed Eleanor's arm in the courthouse and said nothing went home that day, and spent 2 weeks talking to every woman in the farming community she knew. She did not describe the school as a favor. She described it as something that was owed not to them specifically, but to the kind of world where what had happened to their families did not keep happening. 11 girls arrived on the first day. They ranged from 9 to 16. 3 of them had been told by fathers who had initially resisted that they didn't need mathematics, and those 3 sat down at the long table in the south parlor with the specific determination of girls who had been told they didn't need something and had decided to acquire it anyway. Eleanor looked at them. She thought of herself at 9 years old, sitting beside her father's desk while he read land contracts aloud and explained what each clause meant and why it mattered. She had not known then that she was being given something unusual. She had simply thought she was listening to her father, which was something she did whenever he would let her. "Good morning," she said. "My name is Miss Whitmore. We're going to start with numbers because numbers are honest. They say exactly what they mean, and they don't change their answer because of who's asking the question." A 9-year-old girl in the front row, whose name Eleanor would learn, was Abigail Morton, and who was Clara Morton's youngest daughter, and who had apparently strong opinions, said, "My brother says girls don't need to know numbers." "Your brother," Eleanor said, "is not currently in this room." Abigail Morton smiled. Yet, the months that followed built something that Eleanor had not anticipated and could not have designed if she'd tried. The consulting work she had written into her Caldwell contract began bringing families to her door, not just in Hanover County, but from 2 adjacent counties. Once word traveled, as it always traveled in rural Virginia, faster than any formal announcement could have managed. Families with informal land arrangements. Families who had received notices they couldn't fully read. Families who had sensed something wrong in a contract and not known how to name what they were sensing. She charged modest fees for consulting work and no fees for families who couldn't pay, which was a business model her Aunt Martha called impractical, and which Eleanor found worked adequately if you were careful about which costs you actually required. In February, a property attorney from a neighboring county named Lawrence Holt wrote to ask if she would review 3 documents he was uncertain about and give him her assessment. She did. He wrote back to say her analysis was the clearest explication of altered survey methodology he had encountered, and to ask if she would be willing to consult on future cases. She wrote back to say she would be willing to consult provided the cases involved protecting, rather than displacing property holders. He agreed. She had, without planning it, begun building something that looked like a practice. The evening Nathaniel finally asked her the thing he had been not quite asking since September came in March, on a Sunday in the East Records Room, after everyone else had gone home. He had been reviewing correspondence files he had developed over the winter, the habit of working in the records room on Sunday evenings, which Eleanor had initially attributed to a genuine interest in estate administration and had subsequently understood, was at least partially about being in the same room as her, without it requiring any particular explanation. She had not said anything about this because she found she didn't mind. "I've been thinking," Nathaniel said without looking up from the file he was holding. "About what?" Eleanor asked. "About the fact that the person I trust most in the world currently works for me," he said, "which creates a structural problem." Eleanor set down her pen. "What kind of structural problem?" "The kind where what I actually want to offer you is a partnership," he said. "And the word partnership means something different depending on the context, and I want to be certain the context is clear." Eleanor looked at him. He set down the correspondence file and looked back at her. "I'm not eloquent," he said. "I know that about myself. My father was eloquent. He could make a room feel whatever he wanted them to feel just by choosing the right words. I've always just said what I mean and hoped it was enough." "It's generally been enough," Eleanor said. "Eleanor," he said. I would like if you are willing to spend the rest of my life working alongside the most precise, honest, and formidable person I have ever met. I would like your name on this estate in a capacity that is not employee and not consultant, but partner in the full sense of the word." He paused. "I would like to marry you." The East Records room was very quiet. Eleanor looked at the man who had come to her gate with his hat in his hand 6 months ago and asked if she had found a problem, and who had said, "I'll need to talk to her first, and the position at the estate exists regardless of anything else, and your father would have been proud of you," and who had given her an office and a contract with her name in the correct line, and the Sunday evenings without explanation. "I want to say something first," she said. "Say it," he said. "I am not easy to be married to," she said. "I know that about myself. I work long hours, and I argue about things that other people consider settled, and I will have opinions about your estate management that you won't always want to hear." She paused. "I also speak 7 languages and know property law better than most attorneys in 3 counties, and I will defend anyone I believe in with everything I have." "I know all of that," Nathaniel said. "You think you know it," Eleanor said. "You've known me 7 months." "I knew it in the first 2 hours," he said. "I've spent 7 months confirming it." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. Nathaniel went still. "Yes," he said. "You asked me a yes or no question," Eleanor said. "I answered it." Something happened to his face that she had never seen before. Not the controlled reserve, not the careful warmth, but something completely unguarded, like a room with all the windows open at once. He crossed the space between them in 2 steps and took both her hands in his, and she let him, because there was nothing in it she wanted to step back from. "Your father's notes," he said quietly, "produced something he couldn't have anticipated. He always said the best research produced unexpected conclusions," Eleanor said. "Is that what I am?" Nathaniel said. "An unexpected conclusion." Eleanor looked up at him. "You are the best argument," she said, "that I have ever been proven wrong about." They married in April in the Hanover County Church on a morning that was neither dramatic nor performed. The 6 families were there. Reverend Aldgate, who had made the 6-mile journey again, performed the ceremony with the careful dignity of a man who understood that this particular union was not a social event, but something more structural, a different arrangement of what was possible in this county documented and witnessed and made real. Ruth Harper cried. James Harper did not cry, but stood with his hat held against his chest in both hands throughout the ceremony, which amounted to the same thing. Marcus Webb was there. He had, in the months since the trial, moved from Richmond to Hanover County and was reading law under Price's direction. He was going to be an attorney, and he was going to be a good one, and Eleanor had told him so plainly, which had flustered him more than anything the defense attorneys had done during Whitfield's trial. Abigail Morton, who was now 10 years old, and had decided that she was going to learn all 7 languages. Miss Whitmore knew attended with her parents, and informed Eleanor afterward, with complete seriousness, that she had paid attention to the ceremony and taken notes. Eleanor told her that was exactly right. Odd. 1 year after the hearing, Eleanor stood in the south parlor of Caldwell Estate on a September afternoon. The school had 23 girls enrolled. 2 of the original 11 had advanced to reading legal documents, actual property contracts, not simplified versions. One of them, a girl named Margaret Harper, who was James and Ruth's granddaughter and 14 years old, had last week identified an error in a neighboring family's rental agreement that would have cost them an annual overpayment of $30. She had come to Eleanor with the document and said, "Something's wrong with this clause. I think I know what it is, but I want to make sure I'm reading it right." Eleanor had read it. Margaret had been reading it right. That afternoon, Eleanor had called the class to order and told them about Margaret's discovery without naming the family involved, and she had explained what the error was and why it mattered and what the correct reading should have been, and 23 girls had leaned over their notebooks and written it down. Nathaniel came to the door of the south parlor at the end of the session. He stood there until the last girl had filed out, nodding to him with the mixture of respect and complete unself-consciousness that children had when they had been in a place long enough to feel it was partly theirs. "How was today?" he asked. "Margaret Harper identified a contract error," Eleanor said, unprompted. Nathaniel looked at her. "James Harper's granddaughter." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, understanding the full shape of that. "Her grandfather almost lost his farm," he said. "Because of a fraudulent contract, nobody in the family could read." "Yes," Eleanor said. "And she's 14, and she read one herself and found the mistake." The thing that had moved through the East Records room on the evening in March moved through the parlor, now the same quality of something being built that would last past the people who built it. Nathaniel looked at Eleanor. "Your father gave you the tools," he said. "He gave me the tools," Eleanor agreed. "Now she has them, and she'll give them to someone else. That's how tools work." He crossed the room and stood beside her. Outside, the September light was doing what September light did in Virginia, turning everything the color of something ending and something beginning simultaneously, that particular quality of late afternoon that made even ordinary things look like they had weight and meaning. "Eleanor," Nathaniel said. "I know," she said, because she did. He put his arm around her shoulders, not dramatically, not as a statement, just in the easy, certain way of people who have learned each other, and she leaned into it exactly as much as she wanted to, which was more than she had ever let herself lean into anything. Around them, the estate that had almost been broken by the patience of a careful fraud was whole. The records were ordered. The families were on their land. The school was full of girls who were learning to read the world as it actually was, not as they were told it should appear. And Eleanor Whitmore, who had spent 25 years carrying 7 languages and a scholar's mind, and the quiet, unbroken belief that knowledge was worth something, regardless of whether anyone wanted a woman to have it, had built out of 4 weeks of hard work and a lifetime of preparation. Something that would last considerably longer than any of the people who had tried to tell her she wasn't enough to build it. She was not remembered in Hanover County as the woman who proved Thomas Harrington wrong. She was not remembered as the woman a powerful man had chosen, or the woman a powerful man had discarded. She was remembered as the woman who had looked at a room full of people who had already decided what she was, and had quietly, methodically, without drama or performance, shown them something true. And that truth had changed everything. That was enough. That was exactly enough.